All right, hello everybody and welcome to the Abbe Museum's virtual program today. And thank you for joining us. We hope that you'll join us for our next program on November 13th with Natalie Dana Lolar, who'll be presenting a program on indigenizing archaeology. My name is Star. I'm the Curator of Education at the Abbe Museum. And as a museum dedicated to Wabanaki history, culture, and art, I would first like to begin by recognizing the territory from which the Abbe Museum is broadcasting today by reading our land acknowledgement. We are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all of the Native communities who have lived here for thousands of generations in what is now known today as Maine, New England, and the Canadian Maritimes. We make this acknowledgement aware of the continual violations of water, territorial rights, and sacred sites in the Wabanaki homeland. The Abbe is honored to collaborate with the Wabanaki as they share their stories. And today, we're really pleased to present our fifth in a series of Indigenous scholars who are reshaping research methodologies. As some of you may know, the Abbe Museum has been working within a decolonizing framework for several years, and we strive to center Indigenous perspectives and voices in all of our educational programming. And today, we're really happy to invite and have Dina Gilio-Whitaker of the Colville Confederated Tribes, who is a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and an independent consultant and educator in environmental justice policy planning. At CSUSM, she teaches courses on environmentalism in American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women's activism, American Indians in sports, and decolonization. She also works within the field of critical sports studies, examining the intersections of indigeneity and in the sport of surfing. As a public intellectual, Dina brings her scholarship into focus as an award-winning journalist as well, contributing to numerous online outlets, including Indian Country Today, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, and many, many more. Dina is the co-author with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz of Beacon Press's All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths of Native Americans, which was published in 2016. And her most recent work, As Long as the Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock, which was released in 2019. If you have any questions for Dina during the presentation, there is a Q&A box. We encourage you to submit questions there. And following her presentation, we will be answering those questions. So Dina, without further ado, I'm going to be handing over the platform to you, and I'll be shutting off my, my camera and my microphone. But please let me know if you need anything. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Star. Why Pisnaxil Ku Isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker. I'm coming to you from the place where the sun sets, probably about as far as you can get from the Dawnland on this continent, with the exception of Baja California, probably. But I'm in the traditional and unceded homelands of the Ahashiman Nation and Juaneño Band of Mission Indians here in the town currently called San Clemente in what's now called Orange County in Southern California. So I am coming to you as somebody that I identify as an urban Indian, and I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes, but I was born and raised in Los Angeles as a result of federal Indian policy in the 1950s and 60s, which we know as termination. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now and then share a little bit more about what I'm up to. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I'm doing and have been doing for a long time, actually, and how this book that Star was just referencing, how this book came to be, because the book itself is really an example of an indigenous methodologies, and I will tell you why in just a second. But I wanted to honor this this art. This was the original piece of art that's on the cover of the book, and it was done by an artist named Michael Horse, who is a well-known artist and actor, and he's an old friend of mine, and I had always had this fantasy of writing a book that would have his art on the cover of it. And so I'm so pleased with the way it came out. The art piece, it's true ledger art. It's on a document that's dated 1895, and I just love it so much, and wanted to share that with you. Okay, so this book that I wrote, As Long as Grass Grows, really came as a result of my my education. I went back to school later in life. I had been an artist for a long time. That's how I know Michael Horse. I was in the Indian art world for a very long time, and then I decided to go back to school. As a result of my activism, I was doing a lot of what I call street activism in the community where I was living in Northern California, and my activism had taken the form of writing, and I got involved in this casino battle in the Bay Area, and it was very ugly. It went on for a very long time. I wrote about it in this book, and it was really awful, and all this anti-Indianism, just the hatred was everywhere, and I felt like I had to write about it because nobody was writing about it. The media was writing about it from this very anti-Indian perspective, and nobody else was really presenting a Native perspective. So I just jumped in the fray and started writing about it, even though I had really no formal training at all. Back in those days, we used to call it grassroots journalism, and it was before really the internet. It was kind of the last of the era of paper newspapers, like local rags. And I mean, so that's how I come to be a writer, actually. And then later I decided to go back to school as because I wanted to continue writing, and I knew that I was going to have some kind of credentials. And so I went back to school in New Mexico, and I enrolled into an American Indian Studies program. So I went straight, finally I'm old enough, I know exactly what I want to study. And the program was perfect for me. So I go into this program. I'm immersed in Indigenous perspectives. It was really a blessing to be in that program because all of the faculty were Native, all of the students were Native, and it's in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico, surrounded by Native reservation lands, and so it's a perfect place to go study Native American studies. So I was always, interested and considered myself an environmental activist. And I had taken this class on environmental justice when I was in the Native American Studies program. And I noticed in that class that we weren't reading anything. I mean, we were reading, the stuff that we were reading, some of it was written by Native people and some of it wasn't, and almost none of it was specifically about environmental justice. And now I'm talking probably 15 years ago. And so we were reading things like, case studies, things that didn't really address directly, at least to my satisfaction, what environmental justice and injustice meant for Native people. And so I got out of that program. I went into grad school, and in the American Studies program at the same school, and I'm still doing research, on Native issues. And I took another class in environmental justice, and in that class, this grad class, there's absolutely nothing about related to American Indian issues. We read no Native authors. We read, nothing. There was nothing in the literature that I was reading that and it had anything to do with Native issues. And here I had just come out of a 4-year degree program, knowing, as much as I needed to know about Indigenous methodologies and how, Native people and, American Indian studies frames things in terms of, colonization. And so it felt like a gigantic, massive hole in the literature. And in the meantime, I'm writing all these papers around environmental issues. And I decided to do a master's thesis on the topic of indigenizing environmental justice. So like it was my effort to sort of fill that gap in the literature. And so I wrote this paper that was a case study about this battle going on here in Southern California in the town that I'm living in right now, San Clemente, because I had also moved back here while I was in the middle of grad school. That's a whole other story. But I moved back here in this town that had just won this major battle against a toll road, the building of a toll road that would have gone right through a Native sacred site that included a burial. But it was a sacred site of a federally non-recognized tribe, which meant that the tribe had very little legal power. And ultimately the battle was won and the site was protected, but the way that it was protected had everything to do with building coalitions with other stakeholders and other populations like the environmental movement and the surfers and other people sort of involved, that had their interests of their own. And so I just thought this was a really rich site to study what environmental justice looked like for them. And even though it had a happy ending, there were so many other stories that I knew about that didn't have happy endings. But this particular tribe with the lack of political power and legal power still had this really positive outcome. And so it was a really kind of a good way to study like how the most vulnerable, had the success. And so what I did was I just centered what environmental justice theory and law and policy and activism looks like when you put American Indians at the center, because in environmental justice theory and discourse in general, it has as at its core this concept we call environmental racism, and that works really well for communities of color. We call these EJ communities of color where they're being targeted for toxic waste dumps and things like that. That's where the literature emerged from in the 1980s. And indeed, it turned out that there was, the evidence was really clear that, communities of color are targeted for these, horrible, polluting, dangerous development projects. But it didn't, nowhere in the literature did it acknowledge the difference of American Indian people, like American Indians. And the difference is the fact that American Indians are not just ethnic minorities, we are nations with political relationships to the state and long-term land tenure, and an entirely different worldview. And so none of the literature looked at all of that. And there's obviously this huge disconnect. And so I set about to write about that and like do this intervention. So if we look at what this methodology, what an Indigenous methodology looks like in this context, we start with this concept we call settler colonialism. And this is of course central to the way that we teach American Indian studies these days. Settler colonialism being the very particular way that colonialism unfolded on this continent after, you know, the invasion of uninvited populations. And so this settler colonialism, this concept that we're all very familiar with called manifest destiny, which, you know, is all about how Europeans imagined themselves as superior to such an extent that they used it to justify this incredibly violent interaction on the landscape and in their dealings with Native people from the almost the very beginning. Certainly within a generation anyway of the very first settlers in Jamestown and Plymouth. And so, you know, we understand that in imagining themselves as superior, and one of the arguments that I make, and I'm making more and more in my work as I move forward, is the distinction that it wasn't just that Native people were seen as racially inferior. It begins with Europeans seeing them as culturally and religiously inferior, and that traces back to the Catholic Church and the papal bulls. Which, you know, of course, happened decades before Europeans even arrived here on the continent. But these papal bulls set up this entire framework that justified the coming violence and the enslavement of Native people, and you know, dividing the lands that they knew they were going to find. They didn't know what they were coming into, but they knew they were going to find something. And so part of what the papal bulls did was it divided the lands that they knew they were going to find between Spain and Portugal, and then justified the violent incursions into those landscapes simply because they knew the people they were going to find were not Christians. So it had really nothing to do with race, but with you know, how they imagined them being inferior by virtue of not being Christians. So all of that gets encoded into the legal system with the first Supreme Court decision that they decide around American Indians, and that of course is Johnson versus Macintosh in 1823, in which the doctrine of discovery first gets articulated in the American legal landscape, and then that becomes sort of like the linchpin or the founding logic for the settler state. And then, you know, it just builds from there in, you know, countless court decisions and legislation and policy. And altogether what it does is it creates this matrix of paternalism and this hegemonic relationship between the US and the nations, despite the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of treaties that promise to honor the sovereignty of the tribes and, you know, protect, you know, apply protections to their ancestral and, you know, accustomed practices on these ancestral lands. And so, so one of the things also that we talk about with settler colonialism, of course, this is all a genocidal process. We say that settler colonialism is a structure. It's not a historic event. It's a structure, and it's designed to eliminate the native in order to replace with these new invading populations. And so all of that is the genocidal structure that we're now stuck with and living within. But what it also did is it created so if genocide is the killing of a people, there's this term called epistemicide, and the root word there is epistemology, which is really knowledge systems. And so we talk about how the killing of indigenous people also included this epistemicide, the killing of their knowledge systems, killing of our knowledge systems. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. Kind of reframing the modern American, the mainstream American narratives about modernity and progress. And we're talking here, of course, about Western expansion, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, where all this supposed technology comes and it opens up the West, makes all this land, the taming of the West, right? We're all familiar with this language and these frameworks, and it's always posed in terms of progress, and modernity. And of course, it begins with the railroads. Well, maybe it doesn't begin with the railroads, but the railroads is a central part of this. It certainly makes it possible for all of the lands in the West to be open to settlement. But while we have all this incredible technology of railroads also brings with it this massive flood of invasion, and then in the 20th century, we have all this other new technology making its way, and some of that technology is in how landscapes get remade. And here I'm talking about dams. And this is one of the things that I write about. It hasn't been written about a lot in the literature, the way that reclamation projects, dam building have impacted Native societies, Native communities, especially in the 20th century, but it goes back. I'm actually aware of some history of in Wabanaki territory, and I didn't know this until recently, but there's a historic document that talks about, there was a complaint between Wabanaki people talking sometime in the 1700s, when they're first having, when they're interacting with settlers, and they've built some kind of dam, and it's ruined the fishing for the Wabanaki people, and they have stated this to the settlers. And so that's like a really early expression of what happens with this, flood, to pardon the pun, but this flood of technology in the 19th or early 20th century. Here in this image on the upper left is an image of the Missouri River watershed, which disrupted the Great Sioux Nation, which had by that time been broken up into 7 different smaller reservations. And the Pick-Sloan Act of 1944, which created the 7 or just 5 dams, but these 5 dams created so much flooding that it completely disrupted and relocated over 900 Lakota families, and they lost huge swaths of bottomlands that were rich timberlands, that were rich in medicines. There, of course, are burials, towns, everything. And so it's this, hugely massive, disruptive, culturally disruptive history that happens there. And then, of course, Lake Oahe, which is one of the lakes that gets created as a result of that, then becomes the center of a conflict to protect the water there, paradoxically, with the 2016 Standing Rock conflict. So, and like I wrote about in the book, is that water has all this power. It has the power to make life, and it has the power to destroy life too. And so the Lakota experienced both sides of that coin. In the center image here, this is an image of the Columbia River watershed. This is where my ancestry is from, on the Colville Reservation. Here we have a long history, or a very painful history, with dams, with the building of the Grand Coulee Dam on our reservation. that flooded a major salmon fishing grounds, which had been sacred to us for thousands of years. In 1940, when that was drowned because of the lake that was created from that dam, we lost all of the river, all the fish in that part of the river, and to this day we still don't have any salmon there, and we still don't have that fishing ground. So it was a huge, like cultural wound, you could say, trauma, cultural trauma. The same happened on the lower part of the Columbia River down here with the building of the Dalles Dam and the flooding of Celilo Falls, which was another major salmon fishery. So the Missouri River had this massive, like, disrupting, like, it removed all these native people. We didn't have so much removals, although that did happen, but not to that scale. What we have instead is this massive environmental catastrophe, because there are over 60 dams built on the Columbia River watershed, and it's led to the near collapse of salmon populations in that region. Of course, salmon is a keystone species, which means that when salmon populations collapse, it leads to the collapse of other species and thus ecosystems. So this is a different kind of catastrophe. And then here on the right, this is another kind of ecological catastrophe that Native people are living with the uranium mining, legacy of uranium mining on the Colorado Plateau. All these black dots that you see are abandoned uranium mines. And of course here, the concentration in the Southwest and the territory of the Navajo and Pueblo peoples. There are thousands of these abandoned uranium mines, which has left, an incredible legacy of poisoning and contamination of the land, and thus the bodies of the people in these lands that are ongoing. And so none of the environmental justice literature addressed any of this stuff. And so I set about to write about that. And the ecocides, we talk about ecocide, meaning the killing of an ecosystem, which is for Native people always commensurate with genocide. Okay, so in the meantime, we have, in the mid-18th century, we have this conservation movement, conservation and preservation, and then the beginning of the formation of national parks and the protection of wilderness, and the heroes, of course, at the time are Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and later John Muir. And all of this is happening at the same time Native peoples are being violently and forcefully removed from their homelands in order to make these spaces that are then slated for protection. And so all of that white supremacy that is narrating and animating all of this violence is part of how these landscapes are getting reformed. And even in the minds of some of these early environmental or conservationists like Henry David Thoreau. So Henry David Thoreau, like, he really respected Native people. He wrote about Native people a lot. And he, to the point where he was sort of obsessed with Native people. And so some people think that he had this very friendly approach or very friendly outlook about Native peoples, but ultimately he was a man of his times, and he still believed that the Native people were, destined. They still needed to be civilized, and they still needed to be Christianized. And so he believed that they needed to fade away. And he wrote about this. So so this is, all of this stuff gets sort of inherited into the conservation movement and, you know, this move to preserve lands. I mean, we're talking about the wilderness, you know, the virgin wilderness myth, and, you know, native people, you know, wilderness is always are places where people don't belong or people aren't even there. And so they create this, they actually make that happen through these, you know, horrible treaties that push people off their lands. And so this is all, you know, baked into the movement, and it all gets inherited into the second wave environmentalism. You know, during the 1960s, the counterculture movement, the Back to the Land movement, and so it all sort of carries forward in these very perhaps unconscious ways, as evidenced by this book title here, the new pioneers, the Back to the Land movement and search for a sustainable future. You can see the problems with the framing of this, you know, this whole, you know, narrative of, you know, the intrepid pioneers, you know, which is always all about, you know, taming the wilderness, which always means, you know, getting rid of Indians. So there's like little consciousnness about what actually is being argued for here. Of course, we see, you know, and there's all this cultural appropriation that goes on with it, as emblematic of this photo here. And so, you know, I do a whole chapter on this in the book about the history of the environmental movement and, you know, its horrible interactions with Indian country and the cultural appropriation that it gets characterized by, which is connected to epistemicide. And so in this, I want to talk about, and this is something that I do talk about in the book, about how you know, the very different worldviews that the conservation movement is built upon, even though it's all about protecting land, you know, and honoring, you know, honoring, you know, plant life, and, you know, not dominating it and stuff like that. It's still coming at it from a much different worldview, a much different epistemology, and you know, the difference is in the framework, like the way that Native people have always understood their own relationship to land and place, and what we call indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is sort of a broad umbrella term that can describe a lot of different forms of knowledge. It's not just ecological knowledge, but traditional ecological knowledge is a subset of indigenous knowledge. And it's always place-based. So indigenous knowledge is shaped by environments and ecosystems. And because those ecological systems vary, they're so varied across the continent, it results in different types of cultural epistemologies. And that's why you don't have the universalizing that you see in Western, you know, settler societies. You know, we could talk about Christianity. That's a huge piece of this. Christianity is a universalizing system that tries to sweep everybody up into it, into a disconnected, what, I don't know, I guess you would say, a disconnection from place. So it's something that's really inappropriate for people that live in different kinds of ecosystems. And it also, these indigenous knowledges explain why Native people never fought wars of religion, because if you have spiritual systems and knowledge systems based on ecosystems, and they're varied from all over the place, there's no reason you would it makes no sense to say to another group of people that they're doing things wrong. So the other thing about traditional ecological knowledge is that it's not just theoretical knowledge, it's applied knowledge. And I want to share with you this video real quick about what we mean when we say applied knowledge.
This forest is about to go up in flames. Don't worry, it's intentional. We're here in Roslyn, Washington at a prescribed burn, and it's actually supposed to make the forest more resistant to fires because these woods have been really unhealthy. Think of a prescribed burn as a vaccination against really, really bad fires. And just like giving out shots, you need people who know what they're doing.
This is like the main tool of prescribed fire. Get a little bit of a arm workout.
Oh, yes. Today, prescribed burning is showing up more and more in state forest management policies. Why? Because wildfires are way worse than they used to be. A century of poor forest management and fire suppression has created a lot of fuel to burn. All that underbrush acts like kindling. Climate change leads to hotter temperatures and longer dry periods, which create perfect conditions for a wildfire to start. Put all that together and you have the makings of a disaster. Today's wildfires can even take out big old growth trees that have historically been able to stand up to wildfire. Take this piece of ponderosa pine that's been around for over 2 centuries. This cross-section of a tree trunk is about to teach us a bunch of history, so show some respect and pay attention. Before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes in the Western US were already forest management experts. Many Native peoples embraced fire as part of certain ecosystems. In fact, many trees in the West, like ponderosa pines and giant sequoias, are made healthier by regular human-managed fire. The Yakama Nation used prescribed burning to keep the forest healthy and to cultivate different resources they depended on, like berry plants. But when colonists showed up, it didn't occur to them that the forests were so impressive and the timber so strong because they'd been taken care of by humans.
I mean, they were very colorful responses. In some instances, they're just burning things up. They would also notice these abundant berry fields, and they wouldn't always make the connection.
In 1910, there was a massive wildfire that spread across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. As a result, the federal government was like, we've got to take better care of these forests. Time for a forest service. Up until that point, there had been some debate over prescribed burning. But the new agency imposed a hard fire suppression policy. No burning, no exceptions. Traditional burning was outlawed, and tribal members were punished for practicing it. And it turns out that was not the best way to keep forests healthy. It was also really culturally oppressive.
Preventing fires was another way of directly reducing native influence within their ancestral territories.
And forests that had been managed by humans for thousands of years were suddenly growing wild and unchecked. So that's basically how we end up here, in a period of time that's warmer than ever before in recorded history, with a whole lot of very unruly forests. Around the 1970s, some ecologists started to point out that suppressing fire in forests was actually making wildfire damage worse. And that way of thinking has gotten more and more traction.
2014, we had a record wildfire year. In 2015, we broke that record. I think people were, what are all the tools in the toolbox? How do we protect ourselves? How do we make our forest more healthy?
In 2017, the state of Washington made prescribed burns central to its 20-year fire management plan.
We obviously are inheriting a problem that's been over 50 years in the making. It's going to take us a while to get on top of it, but we are going to make a significant difference in restoring the health of our forests, and it will include prescribed fire.
Which brings us full circle, working with fire instead of suppressing it, a practice that's still alive in many tribal cultures today.
What we're really looking at is a group of people that have been able to survive for thousands of years based on their relationship, interaction, and management with resources. I don't feel like you're going to have a very efficient project in today's world ignoring a 1,000-year-old data set.
Okay.
This forest is about this forest.
Okay. So, so you can see this is such an important part. Indigenous knowledge is such an important part of talking about environmental justice. That if decolonizing environmental justice means that we have to be able and willing to acknowledge that that indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is crucial knowledge for how we imagine a sustainable future. EJ activism theory and policy, it has to recognize these histories of settler colonialism and work to dismantle it, and recognize the political relationship between tribes and the states, or the state, the settler state. And one of the ways it can do this is by, really uplifting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which enshrines the right to free, prior, and informed consent, not just consultation. This is a really important part, because Standing Rock ultimately happened because it was recognized that the tribe was not adequately consulted. But that raises the question, even if they had been consulted and they rejected the pipeline, what would have happened? I mean, that's only open to speculation. Well, come on. Okay, so what does it mean to look toward a transformational land ethic? The way that I'm thinking about it and writing about it is I'm kind of starting with this Aldo Leopold's now famous essay called The Land Ethic, that was published posthumously in the Sand County Almanac in 1949, the year after he passed away. And environmentalists really uphold this. There's an entire foundation called the Aldo Leopold Foundation, and they teach his work. And he was very seen as revolutionary for his views on the land ethic, which really just basically was about understanding the human relationship to the natural world as part of the natural world, really not as the dominator of it. And of course, as Native people, we always know that we had already lived that way for thousands and thousands of years. And that's something that N. Scott Momaday had written about in his essay called An American Land Ethic in 1997. He was basically saying that, from a Kiowa perspective, we always had a land ethic. And that America needs, really should sort of follow it in that example. And so I think that, both of these guys were right, but from my perspective, understanding the history, this, profoundly violent history, and the structure that we are stuck with now, that creates this paternalistic and hegemonic relationship with the state, that constrains the way tribes even are able to use land, and the way that the state, still works against tribes in a lot of different ways, especially around the protection of sacred sites. Unless all of that is taken into consideration and there's this accounting for that history, my argument is that you cannot have a land ethic. If a land ethic does not include an ethic of justice, then there will be no real, actual good land ethic in this country. So there has to be this piece of it that of this reckoning, where the United States finally accounts for this history and reckons with that relationship with Native people. In my opinion, I think that we're not there yet. I mean, even though we have, this amazing racial justice movement that has been happening, especially this year, this renewed, these renewed calls for racial justice that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought with it. It's still, it's appropriate and it needs to happen. But there's a place in there that Native people kind of get lost or kind of erased. And my argument is that even though Native people experience racism and we experience that kind of discrimination ultimately, it's really about the land and the ways that we are that we experience injustice is always all about the land. And so that's the conversation that this country has never been willing to have. And until we do have it, then, you know, we will not be able to progress, and we certainly won't be able to build a really truly sustainable future. So that's kind of where I'm going with this work. I'm working on a new book. It's in the beginning stages, but this is sort of the key nugget, the core nugget of it, is how we get to a transformational land ethic that works for everybody and not just certain populations. So I'm going to stop the share right there, and we've got plenty of time, I think, to engage in a conversation if you have questions, things you want to talk about.
All right, so if anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to drop them in the Q&A box. We do have some more time with Dina, but I'll kick things off. And as you were talking about transformational land ethic, I was wondering if there are any contemporary examples that are moving towards that model that you've experienced or that you know about that you could share?
Yeah, there is actually. There's at least one. I mean, there are pockets, I would say. There are seeds of it. And one of them that I've been following for several years, and I write about it in the book, is this hippie commune in Northern California called the Black Bear Ranch. And I started writing about them back in, I guess about 2015, when I heard of a story that this years ago, during the their classic Back to the Land, you know, counterculture people, and they moved to Northern California, Klamath River, Klamath, and like the Shasta area, that whole, like the Siskiyous. There's a lot of wilderness, you know, so-called wilderness up there, forested area, and the land used to be really cheap. And so people moved there because of that. Like they pooled all their money. This happened all over California, all over Oregon and Washington. People did this. And I'm sure places in the East Coast too, Colorado. I mean, it happened everywhere. And so they pooled their money. They would go buy these large, cheap pieces of land, and then they would, you know, learn to live off the land. And so this group did that, and they had this moniker, and the moniker was a free land for a free people. And I mean, you could see like the problems with that, like thinking that the land was free. Where did it come from? Like the land is free. Well, free, what does it mean? You know, we all know what it means. The diet, and it was cheap, but it was that. You know, it was completely devoid of any history, and of course that area has a huge, a horrible history of dispossession against people. And anyway, you know, 50 years of being on the land, there was a conversation started about how to decolonize it, and they started talking about, you know, raising these questions. What does it mean to be a free people in a free land that was that was stolen and people were killed for? And so it just opened up this conversation in the community, and it was a really, really hard conversation for them. And one of the woman that started the conversation, she was a white settler woman. You know, I self-identified as a white settler woman. She was in grad school and writing about this. And it was really painful for her. She lost a lot of friends over it. Like even bringing up the subject, it was just like it brought up all this fragility, and you know, like people, they couldn't have the conversation, but she kept at it and kept at it. And so now it's 5 years later, and they've actually made progress, and they are actually having the conversation about what does it mean to decolonize the ranch. And so that's something I'm going to keep following up on it in the next book, because it's a fascinating story. And I'm, you know, I try to stay in touch with them, and, you know, well, where are you at now? And what does it look like? How are you guys actually decolonizing the ranch? And one of the ways, you know, they've thought about everything from just giving the land back, all of the land back to the native population, to giving some of the land back, to just including Native people in their governance board. Like they're exploring all these different options. So I think it's a really fascinating story. And I know that there are other stories that where people are wrestling with these questions about what it means to decolonize the land. Of course, now we have this land back movement, which is really interesting.
Which leads us into this question that was just submitted. The idea of directly returning land to Indigenous people, i.e. Land back, seems important to a transformational land ethic. What are your thoughts on who the land should be returned to, tribal governments or Indigenous land trusts?
I mean, I think that everything, I think yes to all, like all of the above. There are places where there aren't really people that you can give land back to. Like like here where I live in Southern California, the land is so colonized, it's so urbanized, and the people have been so fractured that you have places where there are all these different factions of the original tribal groups, and they're not federally recognized. And so like it would be almost impossible to figure out who you would give the land to, right? So you'd have to come up with some kind of alternative arrangement, some kind of land trust or something that it would go into. And there's lots of examples of those kinds of alternative arrangements. There are lots of native land trusts and conservation easements and places where native people are on the governing boards, and so they have decision-making power. So there's a lot of different ways that can be done, like the land back movement, including just give it back to tribal governments. There was an example of that recently in 2018. Oddly enough, the Trump administration returned 32,000 acres of land in Oregon. That's a healthy chunk of land. And there are other examples throughout the 20th century where land was given back. I mean, it's not a huge history, but it cannot be off the table. Like giving land back to tribal governments cannot be off the table, especially when you think about the fact that in the Western United States, the 11 westernmost states, 48%, almost half of all the land in the West is public land, so owned by the federal government. That's pretty astounding. And if you think about how much of that land was expropriated as a result of things like the Dawes Act, right, under allotment, when so much of that land was taken outside of treaty agreements in these very unethical and illegal ways.
We have another question from the audience. Are there any tribes or possibly organizations engaged in incorporating Indigenous land management techniques on a large scale, and what are the outcomes?
I learned of one this morning that I didn't know about. I was on this, just before I came in here today, I was in this workshop, the wilderness workshop, and I was on a panel with some other Native folks, some people from Confederated Salish and Kootenai, so the Flathead Reservation in Montana. They have 3 million acres, big reservation. And they were the first tribe to ever form a tribal wilderness area. So they have this whole wilderness area within tribal boundaries, where they have set land aside for particular uses and non-uses, I presume, including a buffer area, a buffer zone, and so they're managing it, according to their own traditions. And I know that there are other tribal parks. There's tribal parks. Others, Mesa Verde in the Southwest is managed by the Utes. That's another one. There in the Great Lakes, there are 2 tribal parks. I think there are 2 tribal parks in, and I want to say Wisconsin. So it might be Ho-Chunk or Anishinaabe, where they are actual tribal parks, like tribal national parks. So yeah, I mean, it is being done. And, if you look at the Menominees, as far as the part of the question about the kind of success that they're having, the Menominee Forest Management Program is well known in Indian country for the way that they're taking care of the forests there. So that's one to look at.
We have a really good question. Is the doctrine of discovery still being used today?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's still the foundation of federal Indian law. And it was invoked as recently as 2005 by none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Sherrill decision, all right? I mean, that's in y'all's part of the country. And, the Sherrill decision, Oneida versus Sherrill, I think is what it was, that denied, I don't know the specifics of that case. I think it was denying the taking of land into trust that was originally Oneida land. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, invoked the discovery doctrine to justify, to argue that, basically there's too much history, too much water under the bridge. We can't go back there. So yeah, I mean, it's the core foundation of federal Indian law. It's never been repudiated. And that's part of the problem, is that these very, not just racist, but just bigoted, unjust, principles, legal principles still structure the relationship between tribes and the federal government. I find that a problem. And I'm glad I didn't go. I was originally thinking to go into law school, and I'm so glad that I didn't, because I would not want to be in the position of having to defend that, because I find it incredibly, it's incredibly not just offensive, but it's just so destructive. I mean, one of the interesting books out there is by Robert Williams, a Native law scholar, who wrote a book called Like a Loaded Weapon, and he looks at the Rehnquist court, and he looks at how the Supreme Court has not evolved when it comes to Native issues. Like it's evolved when it comes to other civil rights issues in the way that it frames things, like around, racist doctrines, like it was able to overturn some of its earlier decisions, like Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 19th century. And then, the Dred Scott decision, and then later the Board of Education, Brown versus Board versus Brown, or whatever that was. But the ways that, he talks about how they sort of evolved, and they were able to to get, you know, to overcome those, you know, like that idea of separate but equal. But when it comes to Indian law cases, they have not done that. They continue to these, you know, the plenary power doctrine, the trust doctrine, the trust doctrine, plenary power doctrine has very, you know, but they're all premised on this concept of indigenous inferiority, that that we were ignorant savages and we weren't capable of managing land or even having title. We don't even own title to our own lands. How is that okay?
Question I've been asking everybody that's that we've had be part of this program is, what are some work by Indigenous scholars that have really influenced you and your work and your passions?
Uh-oh, you froze up.
Books, so. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Oh, you froze up. If you were talking, I didn't hear what you said.
Okay, sorry about that. I was saying a question I've been asking all the presenters is, what are some works by Indigenous scholars that have influenced you?
Oh, well, that one book I just referenced, Like a Loaded Weapon, is something that continues to influence me as far as law goes. I'm really influenced by M. Cat Anderson, who wrote a book called Tending the Wild, and it's really specific to California, about the ways, I think it was really groundbreaking for the way it reframed the way California Indians used the land in these very intelligent, calculated ways. So that, gosh, oh God, there's so many. Of course, now I'm just drawing a blank on it. Gosh, I don't know, I'm drawing a blank. I'm kind of looking around to see like the books around me, like what am I surrounded with here? There's a book here that I really like that came out about 2 years ago, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. This is a great one for anybody interested in TEK. This is one of the best books out there. It's an anthology, so it has essays in there from numerous different, you know, high-profile Native scholars. Of course, Robin Wall Kimmerer is certainly influential for me on her braiding sweetgrass and some of the other. I'm very, very influenced by Kyle Pose White. His work is amazing. He doesn't even have a book out yet, but he's so prolific in his writing. He has written so many and published so many amazing essays. He's an incredible intellect. So I'm very influenced by him. Also, Clint Carroll. Clint Carroll is a Cherokee scholar who wrote a book called Roots of Our Renewal, and it's about Cherokee ethnobotany. Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind the most.
Oh, thank you. We have one last question before we end. Can you say more about the frameworks white settlers adopted and really got going and charged into American culture? This refers to what you said about Henry David Thoreau and others. Why do you think it gets so entrenched in modern Western culture? Read it, it's on the list below. So.
Well, I think it gets so entrenched in modern Western culture because it benefited the settler population, right? I mean, it benefits them to think of themselves as superior. I don't think it's any more than that. You know, they wanted the land. That's what it came down to. They came here and they wanted the land. The Indians had all the land and they knew it. And so they invented all these reasons, all this logic about why the Indians were not capable, you know, all these crazy things, these crazy ideas. You know, the Indians didn't use the land in the ways that Europeans use them because they're civilized, they're uncivilized and they're savages. They don't use the land in the ways that it should be used according to Western Christian ideas. And so, this is what they used to justify what they did in order to take the land. I mean, it's as simple as that. And you know, I don't know what else to say about that. And it's that way. It's that gets just threaded into every aspect of American culture. And, you know, we see it to this very day. Indians are ignorant savages who don't know, you know, they don't know how to work the land. Although that's starting to change, I think, finally.
It's interesting because it like works on both ends, right? Like those logic models for why Native peoples can't take care of our own lands, both like for private use and for extraction uses, but also for this like kind of public protection of the lands as well. So on both ends, you kind of see those logic models playing out.
Yeah, it's very paradoxical. Yeah. Like it doesn't, you know, we call it logic, but it's very illogical. Yeah. Because they use logic in ways that that benefit them, and then they'll completely upend it when it's not to their advantage. Mm-hmm. You know, so.
Well, Dina, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to also thank everybody who has attended today's program. And I want to remind everybody that if you are interested in our next program in November with Natalie Dana, you can find out more on our website, abbemuseum.org. But Dina, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your presentation.
Thank you. It was good to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody.